The courthouse plaza was a wide slab of stone under a gray morning sky, the kind of public space designed to make people feel small. It was crowded today. A ribbon-cutting ceremony had been scheduled for noon. New security wing, new cameras, new community partnership. There were banners and a podium and an expensive sound system that hummed between speeches. And right at the foot of it all, just beyond the barricades, an old man in a faded police uniform stood quietly with a small canvas duffel at his feet. His uniform looked like it had survived 2 decades of rain. The elbows were shiny from wear. The brass buttons were dulled, one replaced with a mismatched one that didn't quite catch the light. His shoes were clean but old, soles worn thin at the edges. He was black, late 60s, maybe older. His shoulders were squared like a man who had stood at attention long enough for his bones to memorize it. He wasn't making a scene. He wasn't yelling. He was simply standing where the barricade line curved, watching the ceremony set up as if he belonged there. A young officer in a crisp new uniform spotted him and frowned. He started walking over with the quick confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "Hey," the officer called out. His voice wasn't loud yet, but it had that edge, the kind that wants a reaction. "Sir, you can't be back here." The old man turned slowly. His eyes were steady, calm, the color of dark coffee, with a tiredness that didn't weaken them, just deepened them. "I'm not back there," he said. "I'm right here." The officer stopped at the barricade and looked him up and down like he was inspecting a stain. "This area is restricted. Staff only. You need to move along." The old man didn't flinch. "I'm staff," he said. A few bystanders nearby glanced over. The sound system crackled. Somewhere behind the podium, someone tested the microphone. Check, check, and the plaza briefly swallowed the sound like a breath. The young officer scoffed. "Staff," he repeated, looking at the worn uniform as though it were a joke someone had told too late. "You're not staff. We've got security clearance bands today. See that?" He tapped his own wrist where a bright band sat like a badge of authority. The old man lifted his hands slightly, palms open, not aggressive, not pleading either. "I didn't need a band," he said. "Not for what I'm here to do." The officer's expression sharpened, irritation turning into performance. He turned his body just enough to be seen by the growing crowd, as if the audience mattered. "Okay," he said, voice louder now. "Listen, I don't know who you are, but you can't just wander into a restricted public event wearing that." He gestured at the uniform like it offended him. A woman in a tan trench coat, standing behind the barricade with her phone already out, angled her camera and began recording. Her screen reflected the scene in miniature. Officer, old man, the courthouse behind them, the podium waiting like an altar. Someone else lifted their phone too. The old man's voice didn't rise. He didn't step forward. He didn't step back. "I'm not wondering," he said. "I'm reporting." The officer laughed once, sharp, humorless. "Reporting? Yeah, you're reporting for a museum tour." A ripple ran through the nearby crowd, some uncomfortable chuckles, some sharp intakes of breath. A few faces tightened with that familiar expression of people watching a line being crossed but unsure whether to stop it. The old man's jaw flexed gently, a muscle moving under weathered skin. He looked past the young officer toward the courthouse doors, as if he were waiting for someone to arrive. "Sir," the officer said, closer now, voice edged with warning. "This is your last chance before we escort you out." "Escort me," the old man repeated, not mocking, just tasting the word. "Out." "Yes," the officer snapped. "Out. Now, before this turns into something else." 2 more officers began to drift over, drawn by the heat of the moment like moths to a light. One was broad-shouldered and older than the first. The other was a lean woman with a tight bun and a watchful stare. Both wore the uniform like it had been tailored around their authority. The broad-shouldered officer took one look at the old man's uniform and shook his head. "What's this?" he muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Costume day." The old man didn't react. The woman officer's gaze flicked to the phones. She didn't like the cameras, and it showed, jaw tight, shoulders subtly lifting like she wanted to block the view. "Sir," she said, trying for control, "we're going to need you to step away from the barrier." The old man looked at her with something like respect. He nodded once, as if acknowledging she was doing her job. "I hear you," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere." That's when the young officer lost patience. He reached through the barricade and grabbed the old man by the upper arm. Not a gentle touch, a grip. The trenchcoat woman's phone zoomed in. The livestream comments began to fly. Tiny hearts, angry faces, question marks. Somewhere a teenager whispered, "Yo, he's grabbing him." The old man didn't jerk away. He didn't yell. He simply looked down at the officer's hand on his arm, then back up to the officer's face. "Take your hand off me," he said softly. The young officer smirked. "Or what?" Silence slipped into the plaza like a shadow. The microphones stopped crackling. Even the distant traffic noise seemed to dull. The old man's gaze didn't waver. He reached into his canvas duffel slowly. Slow enough that no one could claim it was sudden. Slow enough that every officer's posture tightened. Hands hovered near holsters. The crowd leaned in. Phones rose higher. The old man's fingers closed around something in the bag. And for the first time, the fear in the officer's eyes wasn't for him. It was for what he might reveal. He pulled it out. Not a weapon. A black leather folder, worn at the edges. He held it at chest level, still calm, still steady. Then he said, quietly enough that the microphones didn't catch it, but the nearest people did, "You are about to regret how public you made this." And the courthouse doors behind them opened. Earlier that morning, before the plaza and the phones and the hands on holsters, the old man had stood alone in a small apartment that smelled faintly of coffee and old books. The sunrise had slipped through the blinds in thin bars of light. Dust floated in it like tiny, slow-moving stars. He stood in front of a mirror with a crack down one side, buttoning the worn uniform with careful hands. The uniform had once been sharp. Once, it had carried a different city's patch. A different era. But he had kept it, not because it was perfect, because it was honest. His name was Malcolm Reeves. He had been a patrol officer at 22, a detective at 30, a lieutenant at 40. He had been told he was too serious, too principled, not political enough to rise fast. He had watched men with lesser records climb higher because they were better at smiling at the right people. He had watched good officers burn out, chewed up by paperwork and trauma and the slow poison of cynicism. He had also watched, with a kind of quiet fury, how quickly the system could decide what kind of man he was based on how he looked. At 54, after a case that involved a councilman's son and a body in a river, he had been encouraged, politely, firmly, to retire. Not because he was wrong, because he was inconvenient. He had taken his pension and his dignity and walked away without giving them the satisfaction of seeing him break. For years, he worked private security jobs, training contracts, community mediation. He taught de-escalation in cramped rooms to people who rolled their eyes until he told them stories they couldn't shake. He volunteered at youth centers where boys with anger like gasoline listened to him because he didn't speak down to them. He wrote letters, lots of letters, to mayors and commissioners and boards. Some got ignored. Some got polite replies that said nothing. A few, rare, meaningful, made small changes. He lived modestly. He took the bus sometimes, even when he could have driven, because it kept him in the world. It kept him near people. It kept him honest. That morning, his phone had buzzed before dawn. A single message. Plaza. Courthouse. 11:30. Don't be late. No signature, but he knew who it was from. The new mayor, elected on a promise of reform, had reached out months ago. Not for a photo op, for advice. At first, Malcolm hadn't trusted it. Politicians love the word reform the way some people love the word tomorrow. Always later, always just out of reach. But the mayor had been different. She had sat across from Malcolm in a small diner and listened. Actually listened. Not nodding for effect, not checking her phone. Listening like the truth might cost her something and she was willing to pay. "I need someone who doesn't need the job," she'd told him. Someone who can't be bought with the promise of a title. Malcolm had sipped his coffee and said nothing for a long time. Then he'd asked, "How many enemies am I supposed to make?" The mayor smiled without humor. "As many as it takes." 2 weeks later, a sealed envelope arrived at his apartment. Official letterhead. A formal offer. Appointment pending council confirmation. He read it twice, then sat in silence and let the weight of it settle into his chest. He thought of his father, who had worked the night shift at a factory and told him, "They'll try to make you smaller. Don't let them." He thought of his mother, who had braided his hair as a boy and said, "You'll have to be twice as calm to survive what they'll throw at you." He thought of the young officers he'd trained, eyes bright at first, then dimmer as reality pressed in. He thought of the city's streets, the corners where mothers lit candles, the alleys where sirens arrived too late. He took the job, but he asked for one thing. No grand announcement, no stage photos. He wanted to walk in first, to see it, to feel it, to know what he was inheriting. So that morning, he buttoned his old uniform, not because he wanted to pretend it was still his old rank, because he wanted to remember what it meant to stand in the middle of a storm and not flinch. He picked up the canvas duffel, slid the black leather folder inside, and paused by his front door. On the wall was a framed photo, a much younger Malcolm in a crisp uniform, arm around a little boy, his son, smiling wide enough to hurt. His son had grown up, moved away, had his own children now. They talked on Sundays. "Daddy," his son had said a week ago, voice tight with worry, "You sure you want to do this? You know how people get. You know what they'll do." Malcolm had looked out his window at the city he never stopped loving, even when it didn't love him back. "I'm sure," he'd said, "because if I don't, who will?" He left the apartment and rode the elevator down, the canvas duffel heavy in his hand not because of its contents, but because of what it meant. On the bus, a teenager stared at his uniform and then looked away quickly, as if caught. An older woman nodded at him with a soft smile, the kind people give to someone they think is trying and struggling. Malcolm nodded back. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't announce himself. He just watched the city wake up. And when he stepped off near the courthouse, he felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct of a man who has walked into danger enough times to recognize it in the air. He saw the banners, the podium, the crisp uniforms, and he knew this day would test more than policies. It would test hearts. He adjusted the strap on his duffel and walked toward the barricade with the slow, steady stride of a man who had already endured worse than public humiliation. Because he had, and because something in him refused to let this moment pass unseen. Back in the plaza, the confrontation had grown teeth. The courthouse doors had opened, but whoever stepped out hadn't reached them yet. The crowd didn't notice. They were too focused on the old man, too focused on the young officer's hand gripping his arm like a claim. The livestream had passed 1,000 viewers, then 2. Comments exploded. "Why are they touching him? He looks like a vet. That officer's disrespectful. He's trespassing, though." "No, he's not. It's a public building." The broad-shouldered officer stepped closer, voice lowered as if trying to intimidate without looking like he was. "So," he said, "we're not doing this today. We've got an event. You're going to move along." Malcolm looked at the man calmly. "Your event," he said. The officer bristled. "Yes, our event." Malcolm's mouth tightened in something almost like a sad smile. "This is everyone's city," he said. "Not just yours." The young officer squeezed his arm harder. "Stop talking," the young officer hissed. "You're making this worse." Malcolm's eyes flicked to the phones, then to the officer's face. "You already made it worse," he said softly. "You just haven't realized it yet." The woman officer shifted her stance and spoke again, louder now to project control. "So, we are giving you a lawful order. Step away from the restricted area. If you refuse, you will be detained." A woman in the crowd gasped. Someone else muttered, "This is messed up." A tall man in a suit near the podium, one of the event organizers, noticed the commotion and started walking toward them, irritation all over his face like sweat. "What is going on?" he demanded, eyes flicking to the cameras with alarm. "Why is this happening right now?" The young officer spoke quickly, eager to justify himself. "This guy's trying to access the restricted zone. He claims his staff. His not." The suit man looked at Malcolm's worn uniform and scoffed. "Staff," he repeated, and the word was loaded with disbelief. "So, this is a high-profile event. We have donors. We have judges. We have the mayor. You can't just show up like this." Malcolm didn't blink at the word donors. I showed up the way I was told, he said. The suit man's eyes narrowed. By who? Malcolm's voice remained even. By someone who outranks all of you. The broad-shouldered officer snorted, glancing at the others like, You hearing this? The suit man leaned closer, as if to smell the lie. And who would that be? Malcolm didn't answer immediately. He looked past them again toward the courthouse doors. The livestream comments spiked. He said outranks all of you. Is he FBI? Plot twist incoming. Now they about to arrest him. The young officer, emboldened by the organizer and the crowd, made a decision. Enough, he said. You're refusing a lawful order. Turn around. Hand behind your back. A hush fell. Not a quiet hush. A heavy one. The kind that makes your stomach drop. The woman officer's eyes widened, not because she thought it was right, but because she knew what it would look like on camera. Hold up, she started. But the young officer was already shifting his grip, pulling Malcolm's arm behind him. Pain flickered across Malcolm's face for the first time. Brief, controlled, like a shadow passing over a lamp. He did not cry out. He did not fight. He simply inhaled once, slow and deep, and said, quietly, Don't do that. The young officer paused, thrown by the calm in that warning. Or what? He snapped again, trying to regain his dominance. Malcolm lifted the black leather folder slightly. The crowd leaned in as if pulled by gravity. The suit man's expression tightened with annoyance. What is that? Put it down. Malcolm's gaze didn't leave the young officer. I'm going to ask you one last time, Malcolm said, voice low, steady as a drumbeat. Take your hand off me. The young officer hesitated, and in that hesitation, the courthouse doors behind them opened wider. A woman stepped out first. The mayor. She moved quickly, not smiling. No entourage fluff. Just purposeful steps, jaws set, eyes locked on the scene. Behind her came several officials, city attorney, council members, a tall man with a camera crew, and, unmistakably, the interim police chief in his dress uniform. The crowd noticed the movement like a tide turning. Heads swiveled. Phones pivoted. The trenchcoat woman's livestream swung around to catch the mayor approaching, then back to Malcolm being held. The mayor's voice cut through the plaza like a blade. Get your hands off him. Every officer froze. The young officer's mouth opened, then shut. Confusion splashed across his face. He stammered. His trespassing. I said, the mayor repeated, stepping closer, get your hands off him. The young officer released Malcolm as if his fingers had been burned. Malcolm's arm dropped back to his side. He rolled his shoulder once, slow, working out the pain without drama. The interim chief looked shaken, not surprised, exactly. More like a man watching a car crash and realizing he's in the driver's seat. Sir, the interim chief said, voice careful, is everything all right? Malcolm finally turned fully toward the approaching officials. He held the black leather folder in both hands now, and when he spoke, his voice carried. Not because he shouted, because the plaza had gone so quiet that even a whisper could have echoed. No, Malcolm said, everything is not all right. He opened the folder. Inside was a thick packet of documents on official letterhead. The seal of the city. Signatures. He pulled out the top page and held it up so the cameras could see the bold text. The mayor stepped beside him, facing the crowd, and lifted her own microphone. No podium now, no stage comfort. This man, she said, voice tight with controlled anger, is Malcolm Reeves. Her eyes swept the officers. This man, she continued, is the newly appointed chief of police of this city, effective today. A shockwave went through the crowd. Not metaphorical. You could see it. Mouths fell open. Hands flew to faces. A man near the front whispered, no way, like he just watched the laws of physics break. The young officer's face drained of color. The broad-shouldered officer blinked hard. Once, twice, as if he could clear what he was seeing. The woman officer's eyes widened, then dropped to the ground, shame and disbelief mixing in her posture. The suit man's lips parted. No sound came out. Phones captured it all. The live stream exploded. Oh my God. The new chief. They grabbed the chief. This is insane. Malcolm didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply looked at the young officer who had just tried to cuff him. Then he looked at the cameras. And for a moment, the plaza held its breath. Malcolm spoke in a steady voice that didn't ask for attention. It assumed it. Badge numbers, he said. All of you. The interim chief swallowed hard. The broad-shouldered officer's hand trembled as he reached for his notepad. The young officer looked like he might fall over. Malcolm turned slightly and addressed the mayor and city attorney. He said, respectful, I want this entire incident preserved. Body cams, dash cams, security footage. I want the raw files. No edits. No missing minutes. The city attorney nodded, already pulling out a phone. Malcolm looked back at the crowd, at the bystanders, at the phones, at the faces full of shock. Then he said something that didn't sound like triumph. It sounded like grief. This, he said, gesturing to the entire scene, is exactly why I'm here. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with recognition. The consequences didn't arrive like a single dramatic moment. They arrived like a storm front. Slow at first, then impossible to ignore. Within an hour, the livestream clips were everywhere. Not just local, national. A worn-uniformed old black man being mocked, grabbed, threatened, then revealed as the new police chief. The headline wrote itself, and the internet did what it always does, amplified every detail until the whole country could see a city soul on display. The department issued a statement by evening. It was the usual at first. We are reviewing the situation. The public didn't accept it this time, because the footage was too clear, because the humiliation was too loud, because the reversal had lit a fuse. By the next morning, the mayor held a press conference. No banners, no celebration, just hard truths. She announced the young officer had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. So had the broad-shouldered officer, for his remarks and failure to intervene. The event organizer in the suit, who turned out to be the head of a private security contractor hired to assist with crowd control, had his contract suspended. City council members publicly questioned why a private contractor had so much influence over a public courthouse event. Protesters gathered outside the precinct with signs. Not just angry signs. Heartbroken ones. Dignity is not a perk. Respect should be standard issue. Who do you think belongs? Malcolm sat in his new office on the third floor of headquarters. The paint smelled fresh, like they'd hurried to make it look ready. A framed photograph of past chiefs hung on one wall. A row of faces, mostly white, mostly stern, all men. There was an empty space where Malcolm's photo would one day go, and he stared at it longer than he needed to. He didn't feel victorious. He felt tired. His arms still ached where fingers had gripped him too hard. But more than that, something deeper ached. Because the incident wasn't about him. Not really. It was about how easily people decided he didn't belong. How quickly authority turned into contempt. How fast a crowd could become a courtroom of assumptions. The internal affairs investigation began immediately, but Malcolm didn't treat it like a box to check. He brought in an outside oversight panel. Civil rights advocates. Retired judges. Community leaders. Not to advise. To watch. To measure. To hold accountable. Some officers resented it. You could hear it in the hallways, feel it in the way conversations stopped when Malcolm walked past. He didn't flinch. He asked for complete personnel records. He asked for complaint histories. He asked for training logs. He asked for data on stops, arrests, use of force incidents, broken down by neighborhood, by race, by officer. Numbers didn't lie, but they did reveal. And what they revealed was a department full of people who thought bias was something other people had. The young officer, Officer Grady, was 26. 5 years on the force. Clean record on paper, but a trail of attitude complaints dismissed as misunderstandings. When Malcolm sat across from him in a quiet interview room, Grady's eyes were red. He looked smaller now, not because his body had changed, because his certainty had cracked. I didn't know, Grady said, voice shaking. I swear I didn't know. If I'd known. Malcolm held up a hand, stopping him. That's not the point, Malcolm said calmly. Grady blinked, confused. But, sir, If I'd known you were. If you'd known I was the chief, Malcolm finished, voice steady, you would have treated me like a human being. Grady's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Malcolm leaned back slightly. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. Outside the room, the building carried on, papers shuffling, phones ringing, the machinery of law enforcement grinding forward. Malcolm's voice softened, not with pity, but with clarity. You're telling me your respect has conditions, he said. That it's something you hand out based on what you think someone can do to you. Grady's shoulders hunched, the truth landing like a weight. Malcolm slid a folder across the table. Your actions are being investigated, he said. There will be consequences. But the bigger consequence is this: the city saw you. Not the badge. You. Grady stayed at the folder like it might burn him. News outlets reported that several sponsors of the courthouse event pulled their donations, furious that their community partnership had turned into a national scandal. The private contractor's parent company saw its stock dip over the next week after investors worried about legal exposure. A lawsuit was filed by a local civil rights organization, not on Malcolm's behalf, but on behalf of citizens who argued the footage proved a pattern of discriminatory enforcement. The department's union tried to push back, calling it political theater. Malcolm met with a union leader behind closed doors. No shouting leaked through the walls. No dramatic threats. Just a quiet conversation that left the union leader exiting with a face like a man who'd realized he was negotiating with someone who wouldn't bend. Malcolm didn't fire people for applause. He didn't grandstand. He followed the process. But he didn't let the process protect wrongdoing. Officer Grady was terminated after the investigation concluded he violated use of force policy, engaged in conduct unbecoming, and escalated a situation without reasonable cause. The broad-shouldered officer received a long suspension and was demoted. The woman officer, who had attempted to intervene but hadn't stopped it, was required to undergo retraining and placed under a performance review plan. She asked for a meeting with Malcolm afterward. When she sat in his office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, she didn't make excuses. I froze, she admitted, because I didn't want the others to turn on me. And because it was easier to go along than to do the right thing. Malcolm watched her quietly. Then he nodded once. Thank you for telling the truth, he said. Now prove you can live it. Outside, the city argued. Some called Malcolm's actions too harsh. Others said they weren't harsh enough. But the footage didn't disappear. It lived online, immortal and unavoidable. And every time someone watched it, they watched a choice being made, to see a man as a threat instead of a person. The department's reputation didn't heal quickly. Trust, once broken, doesn't snap back like rubber. It fractures like glass. And if you want it whole again, you don't glue it in the dark. You rebuild it in the light. That was Malcolm's work now. A week after the incident, Malcolm stood in front of a room filled with officers. Not a press conference. No cameras. Just the people who wore the badge. The air was tight. Some faces were guarded. Some were curious. A few were openly resentful. Malcolm didn't start with statistics. He didn't start with discipline. He started with a story. When I was a young officer, he said, I got called to a domestic dispute on Elm Street. A man had a knife. People were screaming. My partner was ready to rush the door. He paused, letting them see it. I didn't rush, he continued. I listened. I talked. I got the man to put the knife down. Not because I was a hero, because I understood something. He walked slowly across the front of the room, hands relaxed at his sides. Fear makes you fast, he said, but fear also makes you stupid. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. Malcolm's gaze swept over them. You have power, he said, and power is a mirror. It shows you who you really are. He stopped and looked at them like a man who had buried too many friends to waste time. Some of you think respect is something people have to earn from you, he said. Like you're the judge, and everyone else is on trial. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. But the badge doesn't make you better than anyone, he said. It makes you responsible for everyone. Silence held. Malcolm's eyes softened slightly, but his spine didn't. The day on that plaza, he said, I wasn't hurt most by the grip on my arm. I've been grabbed before. I've been shoved before. I've been called names you wouldn't repeat in front of your mothers. A few heads lowered. What hate, Malcolm said, was how normal it felt to some of you. He let that land. You keep asking, what if he wasn't the chief? Malcolm continued. That's the wrong question. He pointed gently toward the room, not accusing, just directing. The question is, why did it take a title for you to see a man's dignity? A deep stillness settled. He spoke again, slower now, each word shaped carefully. If you can only be kind when you're being watched, he said, then you're not kind. You're careful. If you can only be fair when you're afraid of consequences, he continued, then you're not fair. You're strategic. He paused. And if you can only treat someone like they belong when you think they have something you want, he said, then you don't understand what service means. A few officers blinked rapidly. Someone swallowed hard. Malcolm's voice warmed, not into sentiment, but into something stronger. I'm not here to humiliate you, he said. I'm not here to break you. I'm here to build something we can all stand behind without shame. He spread his hands, palms up. Because the city doesn't need perfect officers, he said. It needs honest ones. He looked around the room, meeting eyes. The standard is simple, he said, and his voice became quiet enough to force them to lean in. Treat people with dignity when you think it costs you something, especially then. He let the words hang. Then he nodded once, as if concluding a vow. That's what I expect, he said. From you. From me. From all of us. The room stayed silent for a long moment after he finished. Not because they didn't know what to say, because something in them was realizing they had never been asked to be that brave. Months passed. The seasons shifted the city's color. Spring brought rain that cleaned the streets and flooded the gutters. Summer arrived with heat that made tempers short and nights loud. Through it all, Malcolm worked. He changed training protocols. Not just a bias seminar that people mocked and forgot. He required scenario-based de-escalation drills with community volunteers acting as role players. He required officers to spend time in neighborhoods they patrolled without making stops, just walking, talking, listening, learning names. He increased transparency. Public dashboards showing complaints and outcomes, use of force reports, policy updates. He met with community groups weekly, not as a guest, but as a man accountable to them. Some people came to those meetings ready to hate him because of the uniform he wore. He didn't blame them. He listened anyway. One evening, a mother stood up in a community center and held up a photo of her son. He was unarmed, she said, voice trembling. And I don't know how to forgive. The room tightened, grief passing through like electricity. Malcolm stood slowly. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her to heal. He didn't demand patience. He said, you don't owe anyone forgiveness, but you deserve truth, and you deserve a system that doesn't make your loss normal. He looked her in the eyes. I can't undo what happened, he said, but I can make sure the department no longer treats your pain like background noise. After the meeting, she approached him and asked quietly, do you really mean that? Malcolm nodded. I mean it enough to lose sleep over it, he said. The city began to notice small changes first. A viral clip, this time different, showed an officer calmly talking a man down from a breakdown instead of tackling him. A business owner posted online about how patrol officers helped mediate a conflict without threats. A teenager shared a video of officers playing basketball at a park. No staged smiles, just awkward humanity. It wasn't magic. It didn't erase the past, but it cracked open a possibility. Inside the department, some officers resisted. A few quit. A few transferred. Some fought every change like it was an insult. Malcolm accepted the losses. Not with cruelty. With clarity. You can't build a better house with rotted beams. Others surprised him. The woman officer from the plaza, the one who had frozen, showed up to every training, asked questions, challenged colleagues who made jokes about soft policing. One day she stopped Malcolm in the hallway. I used to think courage was kicking doors, she said. Now I think it might be standing alone in a room full of people who want you to shut up. Malcolm looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. That's a kind of courage, he said. And it counts. Officer Grady's story didn't disappear either. He tried to appeal his termination. The union backed him at first. then quietly stepped away when the evidence and public pressure became impossible to ignore. Months later, Malcolm received a letter, not from the union, not from an attorney, from Grady. It was handwritten. The handwriting was messy, like a man fighting his own shame. He wrote about losing the job, about friends turning away, about watching the footage again and again, seeing himself from the outside like a stranger he didn't recognize. He wrote one line that Malcolm read twice. "I didn't know I was that kind of person until everyone else did." Malcolm folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not as a trophy, as a reminder. Change wasn't just about policies. It was about people facing themselves. And that was always the hardest work. On the anniversary of the Plaza incident, the city held a community forum outside the courthouse. No barricades, no private security contractor, just chairs arranged in a wide circle under open sky. Malcolm arrived early, not in the worn uniform, but in his chief's dress uniform, sharp, clean, the badge catching light. Yet his face was the same, calm, steady. He stood near the spot where he had been grabbed a year earlier and watched people arrive, officers, residents, teenagers, elders, families, activists, skeptics. A woman with a phone approached him, hesitant. "I was the one recording," she said, holding up her device as if it were evidence. "That day, I didn't know what was happening. I felt like someone needed to see it." Malcolm nodded. "They did," he said. She swallowed. Are you okay?" Malcolm looked at the courthouse doors, then back at the crowd gathering. He answered honestly. "I'm better than I was," he said, "because now we're talking about what we used to hide." The forum began. People spoke. Some cried. Some accused. Some apologized. Some argued. But no one was dragged away. No one was mocked. No one was told they didn't belong. When the sun lowered and the plaza lights flickered on, Malcolm stood to close the gathering. He didn't speak long. He didn't preach. He said, "A city is not its buildings. It's its behavior. It's what we tolerate. It's what we protect. It's who we decide is worthy of respect." He looked around at the circle. "And the test isn't how we act when it's easy," he said. "The test is how we act when we think no one important is watching." A hush fell, not tense this time, but thoughtful. He ended with a question that wasn't meant to sting. It was meant to open a door. "Who do you become?" he asked, "when you have power and you think the person in front of you can't do anything back?" He let that sit in the air. Then he stepped down and joined the circle again, not above it, just part of it. So here's the question for you. When you see someone being doubted, dismissed, or humiliated in public, someone who looks out of place to the wrong eyes, what part of you shows up first? The part that assumes, or the part that sees?